His Majesty King Faisal ibn Abdul Aziz al-Saud, King of Saudi Arabia. Born 1905, son of a minor desert prince, died March 1975, one of the most important men in the world. During the 71 years of his life, Faisal witnessed the very formation of his country. He saw it take its present shape and rise to recognition, not only as a power among the Arabs, but in the world as a whole. And he saw it change from a loosely knit confederation of poor tribes into a modern state, enjoying all the benefits of a booming economy and an advanced industrialized society. For more than 50 years, Faisal watched over his country's advance, taking part in it, initiating it and guiding it, as his father's right-hand man, as his brother's crown prince, and as king himself. The story of Faisal is that of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia itself, the culmination of 2 centuries of struggle by the al-Saud family. The roots of the nation lie here, in Dir'iyah, home of the first Saudi kingdom a couple of 100 years ago. That state fell foul of the Turks, and in 1817 Dir'iyah was captured. The Saud family struggled to build their state again, but under renewed Turkish pressure, it fell apart once more. By 1870, the Turks had seized control of al-Ahsa on the Arabian Gulf Coast. A few years later, the Rashidi tribe from Ha'il captured the new capital, Riyadh. The last emir, Abdul Rahman, was forced into exile with his young son, Abdul Aziz, later known as Ibn Saud, and family fortunes seemed as though they had reached a point of no return.
The young Ibn Saud initiated the climb back to power. With a small band of followers, he marched on Riyadh in 1902. In a short and bloody battle, the Rashidi governor was killed, and Ibn Saud was acclaimed as a liberator and the new emir of the state of Najd.
The infant state was tiny. To the east and west, the traditional enemy, the Turk, held the Gulf Coast and the holy city of Mecca. In the north, the Rashidis of Ha'il swore vengeance, turning to the Turks for aid.
The Turks poured in men and guns to help the Rashidis. But Ibn Saud knew the desert like the palm of his hand and held the affection and love of his people. In a series of swift campaigns, he beat back the invader, leaving a whole Turkish army destroyed in the desert. He then turned on al-Ahsa, leaving only a few forts as evidence of the Turkish presence. A few months later, the Turks became involved in the First World War, though continuing to back the Rashidis. But Ibn Saud and his desert army held out yet again. Away in Europe, a bigger and bloodier conflict was underway. The war destroyed the Turkish Empire, and when it was over, Ibn Saud was invited to send a delegation to London to discuss the future of the whole of Arabia. To represent him, he chose his son, Faisal. The boy was scarcely 14, yet already well tutored in the faith, the ways, and the wisdom of his forefathers, a training that was to stand him in good stead for the rest of his life.
The visit brought Faisal to a world totally different from his own, for the car had not yet reached Riyadh. And one part of the visit took him to see captured German submarines in the River Thames, weapons of war far removed from the cavalry charges of the Rashidi campaigns. Faisal and the other Arab delegates to the conference found their hosts keen to show them a wide variety of glimpses of British life. And for the young prince, perhaps the most interesting was a visit to the studios of one of the world's first newsreel film companies. Accompanied by his father's friend, St John Philby, Faisal had an early chance to become accustomed to the cameras he was to face so frequently throughout the rest of his life.
The visit didn't take Faisal's mind off the failure of the conference he'd come to attend. The British were quite simply uninterested in Arab unity, and at home, Faisal's father was facing a major threat from the Kingdom of Hijaz on the Red Sea. The ruler of the Hijaz was Sharif Hussein of Mecca, who'd thrown off Turkish rule during the World War and then claimed the title of Caliph of Islam, hoping to achieve dominance over all Muslims. For that claim, he was prepared to fight. Sharif Hussein, though, failed to protect the faithful even on the way to the holy city of Mecca itself. In 1924, after years of problems, Ibn Saud took action, determined to restore justice and peace to the holy cities. And in that campaign, the young Faisal was commander of one of his father's armies. The campaign was swift and almost bloodless, and Ibn Saud entered Mecca as a pilgrim and as a conqueror.
The shape of the present-day state emerged, with Nejd and Hijaz at its heart, stretching from the Arabian Gulf to the Red Sea, from Jordan and Iraq to Yemen and Oman. Ibn Saud became king of the Hijaz and Nejd, and delegated his power in Hijaz to Faisal, who ruled as viceroy in Jeddah. Faisal was already an acknowledged military leader. The Hijaz proved he could govern, too. As time went by, he became more and more his father's right-hand man. In 1932, Nejd and Hijaz together became Saudi Arabia. King Abdul Aziz decided to send a representative to seek recognition for his state, and for that task, Faisal was the obvious choice. The tour took Faisal right round Europe, where he was impressed by the continent's technological advances. He also visited the Soviet Union, but developed a lifelong antipathy to the political methods of communism, and went on to France and to Holland, where the Dutch government gave him a full state welcome. Another part of the trip took Faisal to Rome, where he signed a treaty with the Italian government, then Saudi Arabia's neighbors in the colony of Eritrea across the Red Sea, and was shown a display by the Italian armed forces. The tour in Europe broadened Faisal's experience of diplomacy and helped Europe to assess the nature of the young state in the Arabian Peninsula. But at home, there were new challenges afoot.
In 1934, trouble in the south led to a war with Yemen. While Prince Saud and others led an army through the mountains, Faisal struck along the coast, capturing the Yemeni port of Hodeidah and forcing the country's ruler to make peace. Away in the Gulf, the country's face began changing dramatically when a concession was granted to an American company to search for oil. The survey teams soon struck lucky, and the basis for the present-day prosperity of Saudi Arabia was laid down, converting the state from poverty to wealth, backwardness to development. The first oil was ready for shipping out in 1938, and Ibn Saud came specially to the Ras Tanura terminal to turn on the tap for the first time. Though production was held down during the Second World War, within 10 years, Saudi Arabia was to become one of the world's oil giants.
Away to the north, in the British-ruled territory of Palestine, a conflict was raging that was perceived by the Arabs as a threat not only to their land, but their religion too. The al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, together with the Dome of the Rock, was among the holiest places of Islam. From the holy sanctuary, the Haram esh-Sharif, Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad was lifted up to heaven.
The Arabs of Palestine, Muslims and Christians alike, resented the British decision to permit Jewish settlers to come from Europe to build a Jewish homeland. And between 1936 and 1939, a major Arab revolt fought with a large force from the British Army before it was defeated.
The conflict arising from the Jewish presence was to act as a spur to Arab nationalism and haunted Faisal for the rest of his life. In 1939, the British organized a special conference in London to discuss the future of the territory. And at it, Faisal, once again representing his father, played a leading role. A British plan to limit settlement was blocked by Jewish pressure, and the conference achieved little. British attention, too, was turning away again from the Middle East towards the threat of a new war with Germany in Europe.
Faisal, with his Arab colleagues, was taken to a British base at Northolt to see the new Hurricane fighter, the workhorse of aerial combat in the war that was coming. The war itself engulfed Europe, the Far East and North Africa, approaching within a few hours' drive of Cairo. Saudi Arabia remained officially neutral, but extended support to Britain and America in a discreet manner throughout its early years. In 1941, when young King Faisal of Iraq was overthrown by the pro-German Rashid Ali, Ibn Saud refused to support calls for a holy war against the British, and the boy king was restored. 2 years later, British ships were calling at Jeddah on their way to the Far East. In the same year, Faisal, accompanied by his brother and successor, Prince Khalid ibn Abdul Aziz, visited the United States for the first time and went on once again to Britain, where they were shown round the fortress and naval base at Dover, less than 25 miles from the German positions in occupied France. Ibn Saud formally joined the Allies shortly before the end of the war in Europe, and after the Roosevelt-Churchill-Stalin meeting at Yalta, he left Saudi Arabia briefly for talks with the two Western leaders, meeting first with America's President Roosevelt on board a ship in the Suez Canal. After his discussions with Roosevelt, Ibn Saud went ashore at Fayoum to meet the British leader, Sir Winston Churchill. With the world nearing peace again, Churchill and Roosevelt were keen for Saudi Arabia to play an active role in the attempts being made to work out a system that could guarantee world order. A conference was called in San Francisco to set up the United Nations, a move Roosevelt's successor Truman saw as crucial.
If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die. Now there's a time for making plans. And there's a time for action. The time for action is here now.
Faisal and the other Arabs hoped that the United Nations would be a place where the small and the weak could seek justice. And in particular, they turned their attention again to Palestine, where Britain was thinking of withdrawing and the conflict was increasing. So Faisal led the few Arab states in full-hearted support of the new body. Later, their hopes were to be cruelly dashed.
With Palestine in flames, Faisal continually emphasized his father's view that the right to independence of the Palestinians should be recognized. He pledged support to his fellow Arabs, and at the beginning of 1947 flew to Lydda to meet their leaders. But big power politics defeated him, and at the end of the year, the UN voted to partition the country. In an angry speech, Faisal defiantly rejected the decision, which he said had destroyed the infant UN Charter.
لقد شعرنا كما يشعر غيرنا بما قامت به بعض الدول الكبرى من الضغط على أعضاء هذه المنظمة.
Saudi Arabia, he said, refused to be bound by the decision and would continue to support the people of Palestine.
المملكة العربية السعودية في هذا الموقف التاريخي تسجل أنها لا ترتبط بهذا القرار الذي اتخذ اليوم.
The result of the Palestine crisis provided Faisal with clear proof that power, not justice, was the basis of international relations. Yet he remained active abroad, visiting Britain again in 1951 for talks on the Middle East situation and taking the opportunity to examine some of the new Meteor jet fighters. A couple of years later, Faisal returned once again to the United States. With American companies stepping up Saudi oil production, relations were close, and Faisal took the opportunity to meet the new president, General Eisenhower. With the talks over, Faisal found time for lighter pursuits as well. Not long after Faisal returned home, he was to suffer a loss that affected him deeply. In 1953, his father, Ibn Saud, died, Saud became king, and Faisal crown prince. Across the Red Sea in Egypt, too, changes were afoot. King Farouk, seen here with Ibn Saud a few years earlier, had been deposed by a military government. The new rulers responded to the spirit of nationalism beginning to sweep throughout the Arab world, and Saudi Arabia threw its weight behind the new Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, when, in a drive for full independence, he first ordered the British to evacuate their military bases and then nationalized the British and French-owned Suez Canal. Nasser's moves aroused fierce opposition in Britain and France, but he found Saudi Arabia a firm ally, and Faisal went to Cairo to sign a defense agreement.
At the end of 1956, Britain and France launched an invasion of the Suez Canal zone, occupying its cities and driving back the Egyptian forces. What really shook the Arab world, though, was the Anglo-French alliance with Israel, which seized the Sinai Peninsula. To the Arabs, this was treachery of the highest order, and Saudi Arabia responded by cutting off oil supplies to Britain and France, the first time that use had been made of the country's new economic power.
The three invading powers were soon forced to withdraw by international pressure. And the next year, Faisal returned to Washington for more talks with President Eisenhower on the Middle East situation. At home, Faisal moved to take over the running of the country for the first time. At the beginning of 1958, the economic situation was deteriorating and Faisal was installed as Prime Minister. In 2 years, he put the country's finances back on an even keel. Abroad, new dangers emerged. Faisal of Iraq was overthrown by a military coup. With Iraq unstable and Jordan and Lebanon surviving only with Western aid, the whole of the Middle East was in turmoil, and Saudi Arabia, in its stability, stood alone. Yet Faisal moved fast to restore the situation, going again to Egypt to strengthen ties with President Nasser, then about to embark on a campaign to spread radicalism throughout the region. Faisal took up office again in late 1961, when his brother Saud, then in failing health, went abroad for treatment. In a real sense, the change marked the beginning of a new era for Saudi Arabia, for Faisal was to retain control of the country until his death, a decade and a half later. It was not many months before Faisal faced what was perhaps the kingdom's most serious challenge since it was formed. In late 1962, the Imam of Yemen died, and his successor was overthrown by a group of soldiers with Egyptian backing. led by Colonel Salal. Egyptian forces poured into Yemen, bombing not only the Yemenis loyal to the deposed Imam, but Saudi villages as well. Faisal's patience soon ran out.
نحن نطلب الوحدة التي تقوم على أسس ثابتة من المحبة والإخلاص والأخاء وحفظ التوازن.
We call for a unity of love and brotherhood, he said, with each people maintaining their own systems and traditions.
وأن يعطى لكل شعب في بلده حرية التصرف.
I don't believe, he went on, that there's a single honest Arab who will accept the imposition of a unity based upon the suppression of the people by a police state system.
أما أن يفرض على الشعوب العربية نظام خاص بوليسي شديد التعسف فلا أعتقد أن هناك شعب عربي شريف يقبل هذا.
Towards the end of 1964, Faisal flew to Alexandria for an Arab summit, the first time he'd met Nasser since the Yemen campaign began. Their discussions paved the way for the resolution of the conflict at a special meeting between the two leaders the next year.
The period of the Yemen war saw Faisal emerge as king. At the end of 1964, the royal family, the cabinet, and the religious leaders deposed Saud, and Faisal, already with power in his hands, took over the title as well. With his people behind him, he was to strive for the next 11 years to bring greater unity amongst Arabs and other Muslims, and to guide his own country through the pitfalls of a rapid development program. Within Saudi Arabia itself, Faisal's economic policies had already allocated vast sums for development. With the introduction of better planning, new roads, schools and hospitals increased all over the kingdom. Ibn Saud had a vision that oil would solve the problem of his people, and under Faisal's guidance, that vision came true. To face his task, Faisal drew strength from his faith and from his people, amongst whom he remained ever informal and relaxed. Rarely did the cares of office permit Faisal to join in traditional dances like the Arda with his people. But on occasions like this, the highest in the kingdom was at one with the lowest, equal in the eyes of God and of man.
Affairs of state rarely passed Faisal by for long, and in 1965, Nasser came to Jeddah for more talks on Yemen. Agreement was reached on a peace formula, and although fighting continued for a couple of years, the conference paved the way for the restoration of good relations between the two states.